One is a stable monarchy which is held to work hand in hand with the covenant with Israel, and the other is a city. We have not had a single Israelite city. Israel has existed purely on the basis of sedentary agriculture and the nomadic movement of flocks. There's been an antipathy to the whole idea of urban development. If there's a major city, such as Hazor, the issue has been from the time of Deborah, how do you go to war successfully against that city? Now, however, we come to the phase, as a result of the emergence of David as king, when those two institutions come together. There is a monarchy, and it is held, you remember from last week, that from the time that the prophet Samuel anointed David, the Spirit of God was with him. We'll see that confirmed this week. And in addition to that, this same David takes the city of Jerusalem. It's important to recognize he doesn't found it. It was already an ancient city at the time that he invaded and overcame the defenses. It was supposed to be a well-fortified city. The king of the city, in fact, mocked the attempt of David to take over Jerusalem by saying, even the lame will be able to keep you out. But he didn't realize that he was dealing with the ever-resourceful David, who climbed up the water tunnel with his troops in order to attack the city from the inside. You may see that as being a noble tactic or not. But by this stage in the story, which is the second book of Samuel, chapter 5, just before the first passage we're about to look at, we have to get in Jerusalem for David to enter it. In that particular case, we have had a long history of David's dubious practices. He attempts, in dealing with a rich landowner named Nabal, to force that man to accommodate his own troops. He's a fellow Israelite. When the person does not cooperate with him, David seduces his wife, Abigail, who becomes David's wife on the death of Nabal. David, by this point, also has entered into a league with Jonathan, the son of Saul, against Saul. And during the period of his enmity with Saul, David has sought and received the protection of a Philistine king named Achish. And on behalf of Achish, a Philistine king, David goes out and raids various towns and villages. We will quickly see that that is not the end of his, to politely put it, resourcefulness. But by this stage, the issue has emerged: is David's character actually consistent with Yahweh's choice of David? Is taking this city, Jerusalem, by stealth, which in effect is what he did, in fact part of the purposes of the covenant? The entire storyline of the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel together provide a sense in which David does represent very obvious progress. And this is in respect of what is at the time a key institution that already exists. I already said, as Israelites, we don't have a city, and we don't have a legitimate king. Most of us have already understood that Saul is illegitimate, and we saw last week that even Saul got the memo at the end. But within this social structure, we do have what is called the Ark of the Covenant, a great box on which there are figured two heavenly creatures called cherubim, which are large, griffin-like animals. They are not at all the cherubs of the Renaissance. We're dealing with an entirely different depiction of mythical creatures in the celestial sphere. They define a space over the Ark of the Covenant, and the conception is that Yahweh is enthroned within that space. So that the practice, going back to the time of Samuel, who we discussed last week, was that when Israel had to go to war, it would go to war with the Ark of the Covenant. And the conception was that Yahweh and his heavenly armies would be fighting with the Israelites. The phrase that you frequently hear from the Hebrew Bible, translated Lord of Hosts, Adonai Zevaot, is more literally rendered Yahweh of Armies. The hosts involved are military. I have a friend who told me of an experience in which a colleague at Holy Cross College in Worcester gave his class the task of writing an essay on biblical hospitality. And he received one essay in which it was said it must be important because, after all, God is called the Lord of Hosts. An example of why that translation really does have to be retired. One thinks of either hospitality or maybe a huge mass celebration, right? But it's not. These are armies. So you can imagine what happened at the Battle of Aphek between the Israelites and the Philistines when the Philistine armies captured the ark. And within the epic of the first book of Samuel, there then follows an account of what it meant for them to have the ark in their own particular city. First of all, Ashdod. They bring it in to the temple of Dagon. Perfectly natural. What do you do when you capture the idol or the emblem of another civilization? You bring it in to whatever your particular temple is. The Greeks did that. The Romans did that. The British did that. Visit Westminster Abbey sometime and see what is all around the sanctuary. Flags of conquest that brought other civilizations within the empire. And in many ways, the modern museum is the counterpart of the ancient temple. You win, you pillage. Napoleon goes to Egypt, brings back an obelisk for the middle of Paris, and by the way, gives away all kinds of good artifacts to the Louvre. Same thing happens to the British Museum. By the way, visit the Smithsonian sometimes. When you win, you loot. You bring in the sacred artifacts. So the people of Ashdod did that, and in the account of the first book of Samuel, the Ark of the Covenant was put before the statue of their god, Dagon, and when they came in the morning, they discovered Dagon had fallen over and broken. And the account of 1 Samuel claims that since that time, the priests of Dagon, when they enter into their temple, always jump over the threshold because they don't want to sully the area on which Dagon had fallen. That's not what they're thinking, of course. The priests of Dagon are thinking that they are entering into a sacred area, and therefore they don't want to move into it immediately. But in 1 Samuel, the people of Ashdod realize we can't actually safely abide the presence of the ark, so we better send it on to the next Philistine cities. So it goes through Ashdod and Gaza and Gat and Ascalon and Ekron, all 5 Philistine cities, and it's disaster in every case. Finally, the ark is put on a cart, drawn by cows who are given their head, and it finds its way back to the Israelites in a place named Kiriath-Jearim. It's very interesting. Today, if you land at Tel Aviv airport and you want to go to Jerusalem, when you go to Jerusalem by road, you will pass by Kiriath-Jearim on your way up to Jerusalem. And that is the location of the story that immediately precedes the one we're looking at now. Because David will finally represent the moment when the ark comes home to Israel. And that's because he's found a safe place for it within Jerusalem. How that place should be configured, we're about to see. But at this moment, first of all, David organizes a procession from Kiriath-Jearim to Jerusalem. And in the story, what happens at first is that as it is being dragged along by oxen, the ark begins to tremble. And one of the people who is bringing the ark back puts his hand out to steady the ark. But he's not authorized to touch the ark. So he dies. And David gets angry at Yahweh and just leaves the ark where it was. After some time, he realizes actually the people now taking care of the ark seem to be doing okay. So he decides he's going to bring the ark back to Jerusalem himself. Why is David acting this way? Each of his acts, bringing the ark in, fighting with Achish, discovering tactics to use against the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, is recounted within the story of David as given to him by revelation. But how is this revelation communicated? The Spirit, we've been told, from the time that David was anointed, was with him all the time, but how was it with him? How was this articulated? To some extent, it's articulated because David himself has some prophetic traits. He's a psalmist, a musician. For this very reason, many of the Psalms currently in the Hebrew Bible are attributed to David. And some of those Psalms have prophetic characteristics. He also dances. How keenly, we'll see in this first passage, which begins at the bottom of page 1. Here, David is bringing the ark in. David danced before Yahweh with all his strength. And David was girded with a linen ephod. And it's very clear that's all he's girded with. That is all he is wearing is a loincloth. David and all the house of Israel brought the ark up with shouting and sounding horns. This is a picture of a giant prophetic procession. When the ark of Yahweh came into the city, now the story is going to begin to turn. Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before Yahweh. And she despised him in her heart. Michal, daughter of Saul, went out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel has glorified himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of serving maids, as a lout uncovers himself." David said to Michal, "It was before Yahweh." The implicit statement is, "that I danced," "who chose me above your father and above all his house, establishing me as Yahweh's people Israel, and I will play before Yahweh. And I will become cruder than this and be despicable in my own eyes, but I shall be glorified by the serving maids you spoke of." Michal, daughter of Saul, had no child until the day of her death, because they had no sexual relations after King David's dirty dance. She was having no part of this. She sees it as a lapse of the dignity of the monarchy of Israel. David sees it as just one of those things which it is necessary for him to do in order to keep up the support of his people and to make his way as king of Israel. So several themes are woven together in this vignette. One is David's genuine protection of the ark. It has a stable place now. And at the same time, the understanding that David is capable of doing whatever he believes is necessary in order to achieve the result that he has in mind. He accepts the guidance that comes to him by way of prophecy, but he also accepts the direction of his own self-interest. And they can get to the point where they are at odds. And it raises the question, how does David himself hear the voice of prophecy? Several of us were speaking just beforehand, and it was pointed out that the name of the prophet we're turning to now, Nathan, does not appear very often. But it appears in pivotally important moments, such as to raise the probability that when David in other passages is described as hearing the voice of prophecy, he's hearing it through Nathan. He's hearing it through this prophet, who also has to develop new tools of prophecy to deal with David, since David himself is such a volatile figure. In chapter 7, immediately after this extraordinary story about David's dancing ability, David is ensconced in Jerusalem. He has built himself a palace out of cedar wood, highly expensive. It's come to him by Hiram, king of Tyre. And David decides, why should I be dwelling in a palace and Yahweh's in a tent? I think I should build a temple. This is another major shift, right? That goes hand in hand with king, city, temple. We've never had one before. At first, Nathan says to David, you should proceed. You're acting out of good faith towards Yahweh. David's being generous. Seize the moment. He isn't always. But then that night, Nathan has a dream. And in the dream, Yahweh instructs him on David's behalf that David is not to build the temple. that for his own purposes, Yahweh is just fine in a tent. It's the way that he's always been ensconced within Israel. And when it comes to the moment when a temple will be built, it will not be to protect Yahweh. It will actually be to protect the dynasty of David. And so Nathan says to David, the particular passage that we have from 7, starting at verse 11 on page 2, Yahweh announces to you that Yahweh will build you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie with your fathers, I will raise up your seed after you, which comes from your groin. I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I shall secure the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he does wrong, I will discipline him with rods of men, with blows by sons of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I took away before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be sure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. This passage is frequently called the Davidic Covenant. The idea that just as Yahweh made a solemn contract with Israel, so he does in particular with David, who is the guarantor of the defense of Israel itself. And the way it is structured, just as Yahweh chose David unexpectedly from all the sons of Jesse, as we saw last time, so here he decides to endorse this dynasty, but only on the basis of Yahweh's own free choice, not because David has offered to build him a house, but rather as the symbol of how Yahweh is establishing a house for the sake of the protection of Israel. When this promise is made, a major step is being taken towards making Jerusalem look like a Ugaritic city, a city of the time of the land of Canaan. Prior to Israel, places like Hazor that we refer to from the beginning. In those cities, the temple is at the very center to represent the patronage of whomever the deity is. And the conception is that the deity lies in the very center of that city, protects the city, and as long as the relationship between the people and its God is maintained, prosperity and peace and victory in war will be assured. That is the very reason why in texts of these very ancient cities, prior to the settlement of Israel in the land of Canaan, prior to the coming of the Philistines, it's worth bearing in mind that both the Philistines and the Israelites are relatively late comers to the land of Canaan. Before they were there were these cities, there were these temples, and there was also the concept we now know of the king being the son of the deity, who is the patron of that city. And naturally also the deity being that king's father. This is the source of this language of sonship in relation to God. It's the mutual protection between the patron deity and the king who defends this city, this civilization. Especially striking that this passage is framed the way it is, since It was only a successful prediction for the reign of David and for the reign of Solomon. After Solomon's reign, the kingdom of Israel was divided in two. It was no longer what had been promised to David and Solomon. We'll consider those events when we meet next week, but the purpose at the moment is to emphasize that for its own time, this is understood as being a covenant as binding as the covenant with Israel, and it is supposed to last forever. The key difference between the monarchy in David and that of Saul is that with David, the claim is Yahweh's mercy will not be removed, as it had been in the case of Saul. So the text also provides an explanation of why Yahweh has this particular relationship with David. It is described as a matter of mercy, not of merit, not of David being superior to Saul, because in some ways he clearly is not. You never saw Saul get caught by his wife in the way that Michal caught David, dancing into Jerusalem. And of course, it gets worse than that. Wonderful scene, which starts in chapter 11 of the second book of Samuel, the preamble to the final passage that we have, refers to the spring of the year. Now, one might associate spring with all kinds of things: flowers, mud, rain, plowing. But no. 2 Samuel chapter 11 begins, in the spring of the year, when kings go forth to war. Spring is when you can move again. You don't have difficulties of travel. It is easy to camp. And so, it is that time of the year when you go out either to defend your territory or to extend your territory. Either way, you're at war. It's spring. Happy March. So, David is going to war against the people of Ammon, who had been a particular threat to Israel during this entire period. David is very successful in warfare, there's no doubt about it, but the Ammonites pose a challenge to him. Nonetheless, and this is already a sign of trouble, David is not described as going forth to war as kings usually do. He stays back in his palace in Jerusalem, while the Israelite army is in the field. It is from his palace that he sees Bathsheba, and we all know what happens next, as far as she is concerned. Though it's worth pointing out that David is not offered any kind of excuse by the narrative. He looks out, she is bathing on the roof of her residence because he is at a height he can see her. He asks who it is, and he is told, oh, that's Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, which is when he invites her to his palace. And it's at that stage that the text also say, oh, by the way, she was on the roof bathing because she was in a state of menstrual uncleanness. So we get the picture of someone who is not behaving in a way that you would expect any Israelite to behave, much less a king of Israel. It gets worse. She's pregnant. He reacts as no other person would react. Coolly invites Uriah, the husband, back to Jerusalem. Uriah, you've been a great officer, so why don't you take the weekend with your wife Bathsheba? And Uriah says, I cannot sleep in my home with my wife while the army of Israel is encamped in the field. Uriah says that. It never, ever crossed David's mind. And it's here also that the significance of Uriah's background comes into focus, because Uriah is described as Uriah the Hittite. He's not even an Israelite. And he has more loyalty to the army than David has. David, nothing daunted, stay another day, have supper. And he gets him drunk. Still doesn't work. So, David sends Uriah back to the fight. And he also sends a message to his general, Joab. Joab, attack the city. Make sure Uriah is at the forefront. Then when you get up to the wall, retreat. And don't tell Uriah. It's assassination by Ammonite. Uriah dies. David sends Joab a message, don't worry, these things happen in wartime. The child is born. The child is ailing. David, just as he went into a frenzy, dancing before the Lord, you remember, goes into a frenzy of fasting, of mourning, of pleading with God, of sleeping on the ground. Now he sleeps on the ground. And the child dies. The servants talk about it. David says to them, what are you talking about? Did the child die? Yeah. Oh, he gets up, he bathes, puts on clothes, and has a big meal. And the servants say to him, well, you were mourning, and then suddenly he said, well, what's the difference? He's dead now. Well, he was alive. It was worth fasting. Now, he goes his way. What's Nathan to do? He goes to David. And he tells David a parable of a rich man and a poor man. And the poor man had really only one thing. He had a ewe lamb, and that was it. No other valuable possession, whatever. The rich man had all kinds of luxury and wealth. But because someone came to visit the rich man, he decided, oh, there's a nice ewe. I think I'll slaughter that for supper. David says, well, that's outrageous. That man deserves to die. In fact, make him pay back 4 times. And Nathan says to him, to David, you are that man. And then he explained, you remember in the covenant, the promise was that I will discipline my own son with the rods of men. You will be disciplined. And so thus says Yahweh, look, I raise up evil from your own house. I will take your sons before your very eyes. I will take your wives before your very eyes and give them to your associate. And he shall lie with your wives before the eyes of the sun. You acted in secret, but I shall do this in front of all Israel, in front of the sun. So it was. David's own child, Absalom, revolts against David, sets himself up as king, takes David's wives, and lets it be known he's having intercourse with them. It is a forecast of what is to occur as a result of David's own activity. He is being disciplined, all right, with the rods of men. But the moral crisis is so acute that it raises the question, has Yahweh come to the point where he is not only disciplining David, and therefore all of David's progeny, but is he also at the point where Yahweh might reject the idea of kingship itself? That seems a possibility, and that possibility will actually be realized when we talk about another prophet, Elijah, next week. But that'll have to wait until next week. Thank you for coming this time. Yes, please, Fred. There's a very interesting ambivalence about David within these very books, 1 and 2 Samuel. Some of the material is clearly propagandistic. That is, David, being a king, has what a scribe always has, in addition to an army, and what a king always has. In addition to an army, you want scribes. You want people who can write things down. Some of that is practical. You have to trade, you have to have an inventory of your resources, but you also require propaganda. You need someone who will keep a record and celebrate the triumph of your victories. But these same scribes clearly had minds of their own. How do we know that David sent a message to Joab and told him, bring Uriah right up to the wall of the city and then leave him stranded? Because scribes are well informed and they're willing to write that down. I assume they did not write that down at the time and publish it widely in Jerusalem. And yet, they had to have been around at the time in order to know that any of this was going on. Similarly, there's a great deal of palace intrigue, because for David to come into power, he actually had to go to war against the family of Saul after Saul's own death. So you had strife between different royal pretenders and also between differing generals of the houses. The scribes are well informed about that too. So one of the reasons for which we have this very interesting epic, which takes us right the way the first and second books of Samuel, is that there are scribes on the scene who act both on behalf of their masters, the kings, David and Solomon, and also act on their own behalf. And so you have a combination of the praise of David and also of a prophetic critique of David at one and the same time. And on occasion, these two things are combined. So the idea is, for example, there's criticism of Solomon because he was not as good a king as David. I think that's a questionable assertion. Now, I have to agree he had more wives. And, When you have a total of 1,000 wives and concubines, that's excessive. And in that regard, Solomon goes beyond David. But in terms of moral character, I don't think you could say that Solomon is defective as compared to David. Yet it is immediately after Solomon's reign, not immediately after David's, that there is a major division in Israel. There's literally a civil war, and the entire northern kingdom goes its own way, rejects the rule of the house of David. This is one of the most extraordinary things about the biblical tradition. The reigns of David and Solomon, which are portrayed as the classic instance of what God wants for Israel, only lasted for the times of David and Solomon. Otherwise, a majority of the country, the north, went its own way, which was also the richer part of the country, and all that was left was Judea. Why do you think Israelites are called Jews? It's kind of a funny relationship. It comes from Judea. It comes from the idea that all that's left is the clan of Judah, whose territory is known as Judea. Yes, please. Well, that is an invitation. I just broke the cardinal rule. The cardinal rule is that I should repeat questions so that people know what's going on. So, since the actual kingship of David and Solomon lasted only for those generations, and after that they are actually ruling only a very small rump of what had been Israel, should we take this statement, your kingdom shall be sure forever before me, your throne will be established forever, as a prediction of Christ? That's why it's taken as an invitation by Christian writers to say that this is referring to another son of David who is yet to come. But bear in mind that in the time of Jesus, there was already established a messianic expectation within the traditions of Israel, which held that there was going to be a son of David who would fulfill this prediction on the ground, who would take over the entire territory which once had belonged to David and Solomon and make it into a dominant world kingdom. The people of Qumran, those who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, regularly held what is known as a messianic banquet. And in their messianic banquet, there was present what was called a Messiah of Israel, a son of David, and also a Messiah of Levi, a priest. The conception was that the twin ideals of kingship and a well-ordered temple were going to be celebrated at the very end of time, when Israel would emerge as the kind of world kingdom that 2 Samuel 7 is talking about, but has not yet been fulfilled. So this promise does open up the possibility that we're talking about a future figure. One of the candidates is Jesus. But then, of course, you have to adjust your understanding of what this rule is truly to consist of, since you're no longer arguing that you're talking about someone who's actually the king in Jerusalem. Yes, please. The question was, did other nations think that one day they would be the rulers of the world? And the answer to that is yes. That is, when you're dealing with a civilization that does more than survive, does somewhat more than hold its own, begins to conquer, and this is what's occurring just here. At long last, because of David, and he was a considerable military figure, because of his resourcefulness, which was borderline sneaky on many occasions, he was able to deal with the Philistines in the way that no one else had been able to. And it does appear that within his time, there is a hegemony of Israel which had not existed before. When that happens, one begins to think in terms of how you can move further and become dominant on a global scale. During this same period, that is precisely what is happening with the Assyrian Empire. And we'll be dealing with the Assyrians next week because it's the Assyrians who finally are going to destroy the northern kingdom that I just spoke of. Why is it that the northern kingdom, more powerful, wealthier, larger than the south, is totally destroyed, while Judea is not? Answer, the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians believed that they had a destiny for global empire. When they took over a territory, they would destroy it, they would pillage it, this comes as a matter of course, but they would also take the aristocracy, and above all any royal house, and take them out of their country, send them elsewhere, deport wealthy members of the population, and bring in populations that had nothing to do with that territory earlier. It's a form of cultural genocide. You make sure that any trace of that civilization goes away. The Athenians did not behave better when it came to Sicily or the Athenian Empire. The Romans used taxation as their method. The very definition of an empire is it has the ambition to extend far beyond the issue of survival and parity with other powers and to become dominant. That seems to have been part of the Israelite ideology during this period, and it is representative of what can happen when societies do rather better than well, and therefore think they have an entitlement to govern on a global scale. Yes, please.
I have a question about David's stance. I had understood that generally these celebratory dances after war, after moving the part, were done by women, and with David's kind of co-opting the dance be a sign of that shift from nomad to city, from women to men?
Very good. Yeah, this is the question about David's dance and what it signals the fact that he is taking up a dance which you might ordinarily associate with women when it concerns celebration. There are several dimensions in this dance. One is, yes, that it is a male doing it. Now, males dancing by itself is not unusual, especially in a prophetic circle. I mean, it's interesting that after Saul was anointed by Samuel, he joined a group of prophets. He was singing and dancing, and it resulted in the proverb, is Saul among the prophets? That is he a prophet or is he not? So the dancing by itself you might associate with a prophetic kind of context. But there's this thing about the linen loincloth. What, oh what is that about? Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, there are criticisms of pagan priests who celebrate partially naked. And it seems to be the case that as David is taking on the idea that comes to him from ancient Ugaritic or Canaanite practice of the settled temple of the patron god, so you have the celebration of male fertility in association with worship and sacrifice, so that he begins to act as non-Israelite priests are criticized for acting in other circumstances. This is another reason for which Michal despises him. He is taking down the dignity of the office of kingship, but he's also behaving in a way which is extremely strange for a Yahwist. And of course, is simply narcissistic. So I think all of these levels come together in that single vignette and show how the scribes are very interested in criticizing David, even as they praise him. So thank you for that. The cardinal has given me his sign, so that means I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanking you.